My next guest was the keynote speaker at the Celebrate the 8th event on Molesworth Street on Saturday. Melissa Ohden is an abortion survivor and founder of the Abortion Survivors Network. Melissa, good morning.
Good morning.
Now, when I heard about the Abortion Survivors Network, I automatically assumed these are women who've had abortions that were traumatic and have come through them and then speak about it. But that's not the case.
That's right. That's a pretty typical response when people hear the term abortion survivor, but I am actually the child who survived what people call a failed abortion nearly 39 years ago in the United States.
Can you explain the circumstances as you understand them to have been at the time?
Sure. My biological mother was 19 years old, a university student, wasn't married to my biological father, but they were engaged to be married. And, sadly, one of the things that I've learned about my birth mother over the years is that she did not choose to have that abortion. She actually hid her pregnancy for many months in an attempt to protect me. And when her family found out that she was pregnant, an abortion was forced upon her. And it was actually my grandmother, her mother, who was a prominent nurse in the community that they lived in. And so the abortionist at the local hospital, in collaboration with my grandmother, then literally forced it upon her against her will.
Now, this would be, by any standards, a very late abortion. What weeks gestation had you reached?
You know, it's a tough question because in my medical records, it states that the abortionist believed that she was around 20 weeks pregnant with me. But in my medical records, after I survived, one of the first notations by a doctor was that I looked like I was about 31 weeks gestational age. So I don't know that I'm ever going to have the answer to whether or not the
abortionist knew that you were so far advanced in gestation, whether 20 weeks, because your biological mother might have been a small pregnancy. Some women are, and some women are much larger. So who knows? We don't know what scans were done, what ultrasounds were done at the time. We just don't know. What was the technique that was used?
The type of procedure that I survived is called a saline infusion abortion. And it isn't performed anymore, but it was the most common procedure back in the 1970s. And that saline infusion abortion involved injecting a toxic salt solution into the amniotic fluid surrounding me in the womb. The intent of that toxic salt solution is to slowly scald the child to death from the outside in. So if your listeners would go online to read more about it, they would find that it usually lasted about 3 days, 72 hours. That toxic salt solution was delivered and the child soaked in it until their life was effectively ended. And then premature labor would be induced with the intent of that deceased child being delivered. My medical records actually indicate that I didn't soak in it for 3 days. I actually soaked in it for 5. And they tried over those 5 days multiple times to induce my biological mother's labor with me. You know, I often joke I'm pretty stubborn. I obviously wasn't going anywhere. And as much as I can joke about that, it's not a funny thing because the longer I soaked in it, the greater the likelihood was that I was going to have my life ended.
Eventually, your biological mother went into labor and delivered you.
That's correct.
What happened then?
Yeah, so all of these things were quote unquote routine or expected, but it was not routine for me to be delivered alive at the hospital on that 5th day. And, it's been a long journey for me, but what I've learned through contact with my birth mother's family in recent years is that it was actually my grandmother that delivered me in that final step of the abortion procedure. You know, we didn't know that. My adoptive parents did not. And so she delivered me and, of course, was shocked that I was born alive and unfortunately demanded that I be left there in the hospital room to die.
No, I've been reading about this and it seems there was a bucket full of formaldehyde where such babies having been delivered prematurely would be just dumped.
That's right. My parents had heard about over the years, and of course we didn't want to believe that something like that would be true, but it was confirmed a few years ago by a nurse at that hospital that, just as you said, Pat, there was a utility closet there at the hospital where buckets of formaldehyde were placed, and they would place a living child like me. If we survived an abortion, they would put the child in the bucket of formaldehyde, write the last name of that child on the bucket, and they would be left there to die and later picked up as medical waste.
I mean, we don't necessarily know that they expected these children not to be born alive, isn't that so?
Right.
But in your case, because your gestation was so advanced, you did survive. Who then saved your life?
So we now know that there were actually 2 nurses on staff at that hospital who somehow found out about the abortion. You know, it was done in secret at the hospital. They bypassed hospital procedures. Didn't think anybody would ever find out what they did to my birth mother or to me. And somehow these 2 nurses found out about me, and they fought for medical care to be provided to me. And, I am forever grateful. I would never guess if they passed me on the street that I survived what I did, and that the prognosis for my life was very poor.
At 31 weeks gestation, we're talking about almost 40 years ago, the kind of premature baby care they have nowadays did not exist. They would have had incubators, but not much more sophistication than that. What did they do for you to ensure your survival? Because at 31 weeks, you would have been on the very cusp of survivability.
Well, and considering what my body went through in that abortion procedure, even though I wasn't scalded, my body was presenting with a lot of complications and issues. So I had severe respiratory and liver problems. Looking through my medical records, what happened to my body in the abortion procedure, I was initially presenting as someone who had significant heart problems to the point that they thought that would be fatal for me. So respiratory, liver problems, suffered from seizures for an extended period of time. And the doctors just really made it clear early on they didn't think I would live because of those complications. And if I did live, I would suffer from multiple disabilities. I was transferred to a larger, like a university hospital about 21 days after I survived, where they could provide me with greater care. And so that's where I stayed for about 3 months. And, thankfully, I have surpassed any expectation.
I mean, you are in perfect physical health, so you've had no long-lasting effects of that. Your biological mother, 19 at the time of the pregnancy, so therefore, given your age, she's not yet 60 years of age, so she is around. Have you ever tracked her down? That's
such a great question. I spent about 10 years searching for my biological parents, so I found out the story of my survival when I was 14. Went looking for them when I was about 19, didn't find them till I was nearly 30. My birth father passed away before I could meet him, but I had learned that we were living in the same city. Through his passing, though, I ultimately came in contact with his family, so I'm grateful to have members of my birth father's family in my life. In terms of my birth mother, it's kind of been a long journey. Her family reached out to me in 2013, and that's how I found out my grandmother did the things she did. And then it was just about 3 weeks ago that I met my birth mother face-to-face for the first time.
What was that encounter like?
I have to try not to cry. It was better than anything I ever expected. But at the same time, it was probably more difficult than I circumstance, Pat, that I knew that she had been hurt by what was done to her. But to look in her eyes and see how much pain it caused her, I don't think I was prepared for that look in her eyes. The one thing that I didn't find out until just a few years ago, and my adoptive parents didn't know, is that she spent over 30 years of her life believing that I had died that day at the hospital. She did not know that I survived.
Did your grandmother, who had performed the abortion, did she know that you'd survived?
She did. My grandmother did know. And, we've done a lot of investigation, my birth mother's family and I, to try to suss things out. But what we can kind of gather is that it must have been my grandmother who arranged for the adoption to take place without my birth mother knowing about it.
What impact did it have on her life? I mean, did she split up with your birth father? Did she marry somebody? Did she have another family?
Yeah, so even though my birth parents were engaged to be married, not long after the abortion took place, their relationship was ended. And so she married someone else and had two daughters, so now I have two half-sisters in my life. But sadly, she has made it very clear that her greatest regret in life is that she didn't run away from her family in an attempt to save me. She has doubted over the years how I could ever love her or forgive all of them for the decisions they made about my life.
Do you know what her reaction was when she heard you were alive?
Complete and utter shock, understandably. I can't imagine.
Yeah.
And, as shocked as she was, I know that she also lives with this great joy knowing now that her child is alive. So many women don't have that same opportunity that she's been given. And so I know she's grateful.
And your reaction when you found it out at the age of 4? Your life had been hanging by a thread, and quite an extraordinary beginning to your life.
Yeah, the same devastation.
I mean, who told you? Your adoptive parents?
They did. It was my adoptive parents, and my parents have made it clear they didn't really ever intend for me to find out because they knew it had the potential to really devastate my life, which it did. And but it was because my older sister was facing an unplanned pregnancy at the time. My sister was 18, was still in high school, and so was contemplating every option. And so they told her about my survival, hoping that she could understand, every decision that she was considering. And so they told her, and like any good teenage sister, she ended up leading me to the story of my life.
The story of your life and that realization at 14 as to how your life had begun, at what point did that lead to campaigning?
It was a long process. I lived in pain for many, many years. Most people didn't know, my parents didn't know how pained I was. I struggled with an eating disorder and alcohol abuse as a teenager because I was in so much pain. But when I was about 19, I really started feeling like there was a purpose and a plan for my life. But I still didn't start speaking publicly until I was about 30 years old because I wanted to find my biological family first and let them know that I'm alive and well and I'm not angry or bitter about anything. And I also wanted to find my medical records. I wanted to know that everything I had been told about my life was indeed as it was.
Now, as you know, there's a debate ongoing in this country, and the meeting that you were at on Saturday in Molesworth Street, Celebrate the 8th, is about the 8th Amendment, which gives equal right to life of the unborn as to the mother. There has been quite an acute debate here where there is a concern that someone who is medically very ill, the mother's life might be put in danger unless a termination is allowed to happen. Equally, there are debates about rape, about incest, about so-called fetal abnormalities. And we're about to have a citizens' assembly over the next couple of years on this. Do you have concerns that we're even talking about this, or as an American, freedom of speech is enshrined in your Constitution? I mean, do you think we should have this citizens' assembly?
Well, I think having a conversation is important for everyone. Whether you have the Citizens Assembly or not, I think there are always going to be people on either side who have questions or concerns. So I think having a conversation is incredibly important. But I also think it's very important that the stories of lives like mine are told. That's part of why I do what I do, because most people don't ever hear from a child about what abortion does and how it impacts them. So I think conversation is very important, but conversations with respect are important to me.
No. And do you feel very strongly that abortion is wrong in every possible circumstance, no matter how tough the life of that child or how short it might be, given fetal abnormality being diagnosed by the doctors?
I'll try to keep it brief because I could talk about this for a long time. I am the mother of two little girls, one of which was born with significant health problems. She is now almost 2. Doctors could not have detected and did not detect the kind of issues that she had. Now, granted, we don't know that her issues will ever be fatal, but I will tell you my daughter had 2 surgeries by the time she was 4 months, was in hospital for over a month with a complication from one of them, had a feeding tube through her nose. I've been there, done that a million times with her. And what I will tell you is that she has brought me more joy in my life than I ever knew was possible. And she has been worth every blood, sweat, and tear that has been poured into her. So I don't support abortion, of course, in any case, whether it's fetal abnormality or such. But what I do support and what I fight for in our world is for women and children to receive adequate services and support. And so I know in Ireland, there is no such thing as like perinatal hospice currently, which we do have in the United States to support families when there is a case of a child having a life-threatening illness. And I think having a conversation about what services and supports exist and maybe could come in the future is an important one to have.
In the case of rape, though, for example, would you support the use of the morning after pill to make sure that no conception takes place?
I have many friends who have been conceived in rape or incest, and I have lots of friends who have conceived a child in rape or incest. And what I would tell you is their life is just as worthy and valuable as yours and mine. And if you do some research, and talk to some women, what you often hear from them is that women who have been sexually assaulted find their abortion procedure far more traumatic than the rape itself.
Some of the comments coming in, and no one on the pro-choice side is arguing for abortion at 7 months. The Eighth Amendment needs to be repealed without a delay. And another one on the same theme, no one in Ireland is advocating forced 7-month abortions that involve torturing a viable baby for 5 days and drowning it in a bucket of chemicals. Is this really a fair representation of the repeal, the eighth position? Pro-choice voters find this just as barbaric as pro-life voters do. And Mary says, Melissa is a true miracle. It's heartbreaking to hear what she and her mother were put through. Abortion is cruel. We need to protect the eighth. There is a very lively debate in this country on both sides of the argument. Many people saying the eighth is too definitive, too restrictive, and other people saying, no, it's the only protection for the unborn.
And I would think all of those comments, whether someone is pro-choice or pro-life, I often say I've never met anybody who wanted to walk in my shoes, Pat, and so I'm thankful for that. But, what I can say, I was 31 weeks or 31 days, the intent for my life was the same. My life was meant to be ended by that abortion. And so I can't draw a line in the sand and say that somehow it would have been better for me at 31 days, right? At 31 days, I certainly would not have survived.
Well, Melissa Ohden, what a remarkable story you have to tell us. And thank you very much for joining us in studio today.
Thank you, Pat.